In the Wild West, one rancher broke tradition for an Apache girl and changed both their fates forever. A tale of honor, freedom, and love against the odds. If you enjoy powerful frontier stories, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell us, where are you watching from? Let's get started. The rancher rode into town with dust on his boots and silence in his heart. Samuel Hart had long ago learned that the frontier was a land where mercy rarely survived. His eyes scanned the square, expecting the usual drunken laughter, the gambling tables, the smell of whiskey and sweat. But this time, the crowd gathered not around cards or cattle, but around something darker. At the center stood a young Apache woman, bound with coarse rope, her shoulders trembling under the sun. Her head was bowed, and yet her presence pierced through him like an arrow straight to the chest. He pulled his reins and dismounted, the weight of curious stares shifting toward him. The crowd was restless, their voices laced with mockery and scorn. "Savage girl," one man spat. "Let her shame teach the rest." Others laughed, taking bets on how long she'd stand before breaking. It was no trial, no law, only spectacle. A cruel ritual meant to strip away dignity. Samuel's jaw tightened. He had seen cruelty before on both sides of the border, but this felt wrong in a way that gnawed at his bones. His boots carried him closer, though his mind screamed to walk away. The Apache woman's wrists were raw from the rope, tied so tightly her skin burned red. Every breath she took seemed labored, though she made no sound. Then, as Samuel drew near, her lips parted. Her voice, barely audible above the taunts, carried with haunting clarity, "Please, take it off." It was not just a plea, it was a prayer, a desperate whisper wrapped in strength. For a moment, Samuel froze. His life had been built on survival, not rebellion. But her words lingered, striking deeper than the desert sun, deeper than the laughter of men who called themselves civilized. Time slowed. Samuel could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. The faces around him blurred, sneering mouths twisting like shadows, their voices muffled by the weight of her plea. In his mind flashed the memory of another day, another soul abandoned in cruelty, his younger brother, left to die by men who had claimed righteousness. Samuel had carried that guilt for years, buried it under work and silence. Now, looking at the bound woman, the memory rose like smoke. He could not walk away. Not again. His hand brushed the handle of his knife, steady though his body trembled. The crowd jeered louder as he stepped forward. "What's this, Hart?" One man barked, spitting tobacco at the ground. "Think you're gonna play hero? This is tradition." Another voice laughed. "She's not worth it. Let her rot." But Samuel didn't hear them, not truly. His world had shrunk to the woman before him, her dark eyes lifting to meet his. There was no anger in them, no hatred, only a quiet endurance that shamed him more than any words could. He felt the rope with his calloused fingers, its fibers biting into her skin. One breath, one motion. His knife flashed. The sound of the rope snapping was louder than any gunshot. The square went still. Men froze mid-laugh, their smirks collapsing into stunned silence. The Apache woman's arms fell free, blood rushing back into her hands. She staggered, but Samuel caught her gently, steadying her as though she were made of glass. For a moment, she stared at him, disbelief flickering in her gaze. Around them, the weight of the crowd pressed heavy. Hatred simmered in their eyes, but none dared move. Samuel's voice cut through the stillness, low and unshaken. "She walks free." The ritual was broken. So was his solitude. The woman pulled the remnants of rope from her wrists, her breathing sharp with both fear and fragile relief. Whispers slithered through the crowd like rattlesnakes in the grass. Some muttered threats, others cursed under their breath, yet no one stepped forward. Samuel's reputation was carved in iron. Once a man who enforced law without hesitation, now a rancher who carried silence like a weapon. Still, this was different. This was open defiance. He could feel the eyes on his back like daggers. But the moment her gaze met his again, gratitude trembling behind unshed tears, he knew he had chosen rightly. Samuel guided her out of the square, his hand firm on her shoulder as though shielding her from the world's cruelty. The crowd parted reluctantly, muttering insults that carried the stench of cowardice. Fool, savage lover, you'll pay for this. He ignored them. His boots thudded against the boards of the street, each step hammering his decision into stone. The Apache woman stayed close, her silence echoing louder than any plea. When they reached his horse, Samuel lifted her carefully, settling her on the saddle. Her hands gripped the horn, unsure, yet she did not resist. The square behind them seethed with rage. They rode out into the desert, the town shrinking into a haze of dust and memory. The sun bled into the horizon, casting long shadows across the land. Samuel said nothing, the silence heavy but not empty. He could feel her presence behind him, her heartbeat quick against his back. He wondered what her name was, what story had brought her to that cruel square. But questions could wait. For now, survival was enough. The desert stretched endless before them, yet for the first time in years, Samuel felt the weight of his loneliness lift. Her plea still echoed, please. Night fell quickly on the frontier, the stars igniting across the black canvas above. Samuel stopped by a small creek, dismounting to build a fire. The woman sat quietly, her eyes never leaving him, studying the stranger who had broken chains with no promise of reward. Samuel removed his hat, running a hand through his graying hair, unsure of what to say. Words had always failed him when they mattered most. So instead he offered her water from his canteen. She drank slowly, her hands trembling. When she finally looked up, her lips moved, forming the first fragile words of trust. Why? Her voice was barely more than a whisper, but it struck him deeper than any bullet. Samuel poked at the fire, sparks rising into the night sky. His face was carved with lines of silence, scars of choices made and unmade. For a long moment he said nothing. Then steady and quiet he answered, "Because no one should beg for freedom." The words hung between them, heavy and true. She blinked, tears catching the firelight. For the first time since he had seen her in that square, her lips curved into the faintest shadow of a smile, fragile yet real. As the fire crackled, Samuel leaned back against the log, the desert wind carrying whispers of coyotes and rustling brush. The Apache woman curled into his weathered coat, exhaustion pulling her into sleep. He kept watch, hand resting near his revolver, eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Enemies would come, he knew. Men angered by defiance, men who feared change. But for the first time in years, he welcomed the fight. Not for land, not for pride, but for the promise hidden in her whispered plea. The frontier had given him a burden, and with it perhaps a chance at redemption. The fire crackled softly, painting the desert night in shifting amber light. Samuel sat across from her, his weathered hat tilted low, shadows masking half his face. He moved slowly, careful not to startle her, breaking bread and holding it out without a word. She hesitated, eyes narrowing with the caution of one who had lived too long among betrayals. Finally, hunger won over fear, and she reached forward, her fingers brushing his for the briefest heartbeat. She ate in silence, her gaze flickering between the flames and the man who had risked everything to free her from the square. Her voice broke the quiet, low and steady, despite the tremor in her chest. "You defied them. Why?" The words hung in the air, heavier than smoke. Samuel's gaze lifted, meeting hers across the fire. He could have shrugged, offered some tired excuse about impulse or stubbornness. But the truth was simpler, sharper, cut from the marrow of his life. "Because no one deserves chains," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had lived both sides of them. The firelight caught in her eyes, and for the first time, hope replaced the weary shadow of fear. Her breath caught, and she looked away quickly, clutching Samuel's coat tighter around her shoulders. No one had ever spoken those words for her, not even among her own people. She had known freedom once, but captivity had stolen it, branding her with shame others expected her to carry forever. Yet here sat a man, a stranger, who had torn that verdict apart with one stroke of his knife. She studied him again, his silence deep as the desert itself. In his defiance, she sensed not pity but conviction. That alone gave her strength, a fragile ember waiting to flame. The night deepened. Coyotes howled in the distance, their voices blending with the rustle of wind through mesquite. Samuel kept watch, his hand never straying far from his revolver. He had enemies now, He had made certain of that by standing in the square. Men would come hunting, not just for her, but for him too. Yet strangely, he felt no fear. A kind of peace sat heavy in his chest, the peace of a man who had finally chosen a side. He glanced at her again, her face softened by the fire's glow, and realized solitude had left him long ago. She shifted, pulling her knees close, her voice barely louder than the crackling fire. "They will not forgive." Samuel nodded once, slow and certain. "No, they won't." For a moment silence stretched, but then his lips curved into something almost like a smile. "But forgiveness isn't what I'm after." She tilted her head, watching him with curiosity. He leaned forward, his voice steady, deliberate. "I want a world where a woman doesn't beg to be untied, where dignity isn't sold in a square." His words lingered, foreign and dangerous. Yet they sank into her like rain on dry earth. The Apache woman lowered her gaze, fingers brushing the raw skin at her wrists where the ropes had burned deep. She thought of all the years of silence, all the days she had been told to bow her head and accept. Yet here was a man saying no, not with rage, not with weapons, but with the simple truth that her freedom mattered. Her lips parted as if to answer, but she closed them again, unsure how to give voice to the storm of feeling inside her. Instead, she whispered her name, the first gift she could offer him. Naomi. The name settled into the night air, soft yet resolute. Samuel repeated it once under his breath, rolling it carefully like a vow. Naomi. She had been stripped of her place, her pride, her people's respect, but her name still carried the weight of identity. Hearing it spoken by this man felt like a reclamation. She saw the way he looked at her, not as a spectacle, not as a burden, but as a person. For the first time in years, the chains she carried inside began to loosen. The desert wind seemed to shift, whispering something new, possibility. Hours passed, stars wheeling overhead, until exhaustion pulled at Naomi's eyes. She lay down by the fire, Samuel's coat wrapped around her like a shield. Samuel remained awake, listening to every sound beyond the crackling flames, his senses sharpened by years of survival. He glanced at her sleeping figure, her breathing slow, her face calm for the first time since he had seen her. Something stirred in him, a fierce protectiveness, deeper than duty. He realized then that he had not just broken a rope that day. He had broken the silence inside himself, the silence that had kept him alone. By dawn, the desert sky glowed with streaks of orange and gold, the air cool and fresh with promise. Samuel packed his saddle, movements practiced, deliberate. Naomi rose slowly, still weary but stronger, her eyes meeting his with newfound steadiness. He helped her onto his horse, his hand firm, steadying her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They did not speak much as they rode, but they didn't need to. The rhythm of hooves against earth was its own language, carrying them away from the square, away from judgment, into something undefined, but undeniably theirs. Naomi studied the horizon as they rode, the vast plains stretching endlessly, freedom and danger twined together. For the first time in a long time, she did not feel abandoned. She glanced back at Samuel, his figure solid, unyielding in the saddle. A thought formed quietly, one she dared not yet speak. Perhaps survival was no longer her only fate. Perhaps there could be something beyond suffering, beyond running. Perhaps there could be belonging. The firelight memory of his words lingered in her heart. No one deserves chains. She whispered them to herself, tasting their strength, claiming them as her own. By midday they stopped at a ridge, the view sweeping out like an ocean of grass and stone. Samuel dismounted first, scanning the horizon with a lawman's eyes, even though he no longer wore the badge. Naomi remained seated, watching him. His posture carried both vigilance and weariness, a man marked by battles no one else had seen. She realized then that she was not the only one who had been bound. His chains had been invisible, forged from solitude and regret, and in breaking hers, he had broken his own. They were not savior and saved, they were something more. The wind carried the scent of sagebrush, the sound of distant hawks circling overhead. Naomi slid down from the horse with his help, standing unsteadily but tall. For a moment they stood side by side, the frontier sprawling endless before them. Samuel turned, his eyes steady, unblinking. "We ride forward," he said simply. She nodded, her heart swelling with a strength she had thought lost forever. The sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the earth, but neither looked back. Together they rode into the lawless West. Not prisoner and stranger, but two souls who had broken chains and found something greater.